The interior defensive line is going to be disruptive for the Louisville Cardinals for two reasons: a pair of notable transfers and key returning production. We'll break it down on today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Card Nation, welcome back to this Monday edition of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. Today's episode brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. The sports stop sporting like we want them to this time of the year, but throughout the summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right, there's something for everyone every day. All summer long, visit FanDuel.com to get started. As always, want to personally thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville, free and available on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. I said he was going to be back on the show. Admittedly, I wasn't planning on it being this soon, but I think that's just a testament to how well his first appearance went. He is Keith Arutoff, producer and on-air talent from the Pink Seats podcast, a part of the State of Louisville podcast network. Keith, what's going on, man?
Not too much, just breaking records for fastest ever reoccurring guest on a Locked On podcast.
You're not wrong, but glad to hear you're doing good, man. Appreciate you hopping on, especially short notice. And like I said, Keith was on to break down the offensive line position preview. So if you haven't tuned in, be sure to tune into that. Today, we're flipping to the other side of the ball, the defensive line in the trenches, to where I feel like the interior is going to be disruptive because of the key transfers. Thor Griffith and Gerard. You have a trio of overlooked returning pieces in Dez Tell, Ramon, Puryear, and Dawson, who are going to be in the equation and take that next step forward. And then we'll sort of play a little devil's advocate. What will prevent the Cardinals from being disruptive? And it all is kind of, targeted towards the lack of depth, maybe in the position. We'll kind of break that down a little bit. But nonetheless, Keith, looking at both last year and this year, I don't think it's far-fetched at all. I think it's probably far-fetched the other way to suggest that this defensive line on the interior did not get better. You returned basically everyone. Now, you did lose Jermaine Lole in a group of transfers that didn't get a ton of time. I won't even call Tyler Barron a loss because he never stepped foot on the field for the Cardinals, but it feels like the group that Louisville has in the trenches at the nose tackle position, I mean, they're set up really well to have good success this year.
Yes. Frankly, I'm kind of surprised at how much of the interior defensive line depth Louisville was able to keep. The transfer portal this last spring and winter window was pretty sparse when it came to interior D-line talent. And Louisville was one of those teams that had significant depth on the inside. So to escape out of that window in the net positive, you bring in one of the most sought after interior D linemen in Thor Griffith. You bring in a very underestimated piece in Jordan Gerard out of FIU, and then Renee Conga for depth from Rutgers. To escape with that, with the only, I will say, pieces that would have made an impact this season being Jermaine Lole, who went to Oklahoma, then flipped to Texas, and Tawfiq Thomas was a young guy who I thought was on the cusp of getting some time. To see him go to Colorado, no, I'm thrilled with how the interior D-line looks this year. I'm really excited to talk big men being violent.
And no kidding. Speaking of big men being violent, that is a perfect segue into introducing the first of two really, really notable and significant transfers to this group. Thor Griffith could end up being, pound for pound, no pun intended, the most important transfer outside of Tyler Shuck. There's a reason why he is continually on Bruce Feldman's freak list from The Athletic. At Harvard, I mean, video game numbers from the interior: 132 tackles, 33.5 tackles for loss, 13.5 sacks. He landed on Feldman's list because supposedly sub 540 time, 4.95, and 45 reps on the 225 bench press. The guy is a unit.
Yeah, like Yeah, it's just a physical free. And you just took a couple of the talking points. You dove in and did your research. I was ready to bust out the 4.95, 40 and the 40 plus reps at 225. No, Thor is an absolute unit of a lad if we're commandeering British terminology. And I think the most excited person about Thor Griffith getting on campus is going to be Ashton Gelati on the edge, because
100%.
with his athleticism and his ability and just the raw strength, interior line, like if he's lined up at a 0 or at a 1, a center's going to have to tap for a chip help from the guard. And that's going to free up Ashton for either a one-on-one matchup, or opposing coaches are going to have to keep a tight end or keep a running back in to max protect and double team Ashton on that side as well. He's a guy that's just going to create so much havoc just because of his raw athletic ability. And yeah, he was one of the transfers. Like, if for some reason you're not excited about this guy yet, get excited, Card Nation. This kid's going to be good.
And not to mention, it's been a little while since Louisville's had like a really solid interior pass rusher, an every down pass rusher, I might add. I feel like Dez Tell is getting better and better. He's one of the more underrated players in the ACC, and more to come on that front in the next segment. And Ramon Puryear is sort of the same build there. But nonetheless, I mean, his ability to literally be like a physical anchor in the middle of that line is going to help out pass rushing as much as you could hope for. I do shout out to Mark Blankenbaker for tweeting this out a little while ago, months ago, but I thought it was pretty interesting. Have you seen Thor's Harvard page of what his interests are?
So it's been a while since I saw it, but wasn't it like ancient samurai or things like that? Yeah.
So if you haven't seen it, on Harvard's website, it literally says enjoys exotic fish keeping, weightlifting, and medieval samurai history. The guy is just intriguing, and I'm really glad. I mean, his name is Thor, for Christ's sake. So he's going to be a phenomenal piece for this Louisville defensive line, and rightfully so. And I think that he is one of those ceiling-raising type of players, because one of the issues that Louisville has sort of struggled with, I won't say for the entirety of the ACC, because I don't feel like it was a huge issue in Bobby 2.0. But when Satterfield got here in the early season of Brahm's tenure, the size in the trenches has really been sort of a struggling point, especially against Kentucky, against teams with just nasty guys up front. And getting Thor on this roster helps out a ton. Also, getting Jordan Gerard. I've heard it pronounced a couple of different ways. I thought it was Gerard, like you would say, like Steven Gerard, but you said Gerard. I'm interested to see what that correct pronunciation is for him. But he was a first-team all-conference guy this past season for Florida International. Took a little while for him to see the field there with the Minnesota in the portal before flipping to Louisville. And I thought it's pretty interesting that he's the 6th highest rated interior defensive lineman from the group of 5. And I've heard from a source inside of the strength and conditioning program that just say he is as strong as almost anyone on the team. And that has to make you believe, like you've sort of hinted at, is that Gerard isn't as hyped up as Thor, but make no mistake about it, he's going to be factoring into the 2 deep this season.
100%. And I will come out and admit this now. I am a college football sicko. So I watched a lot of CUSA football. So Florida International, one of those teams that was regularly on my screen during the course of the season last year. And the impact he made, I feel like he's going to be a phenomenal run-stuffing defensive tackle, because not just does he have the strength not to get pushed off the ball by one lineman, he's very disciplined and very smart when you watch him playing against stretch run teams. He's very quick to realize, oh, my O-lineman's stepping this way, and they coach you. If your O-lineman's stepping that way, you follow your O-lineman while keeping your eyes up to the backfield. Fantastic, and has the agility to actually stretch the field and not get left behind in the stretch run game. He's one of those guys who I was excited about when we signed him, because I was one of the few who was watching those CUSA Tuesdays in December. But
no shame. Keith is showing no shame. college football conference USA enjoyer, Keith Arutoff.
Oh yeah, I don't discriminate. All the G5, give me all of it. But
who's the most random team that you've gravitated toward watching the most of like the non-Power 5 schools that are like, and then the group of 5 schools that like aren't talked about the most? Who's like the weirdest infatuation with a team last season that you remember like, oh, I gotta watch them play?
So last season throws a bit of a wrench into the plan because before last year, if a Kent State game was on, I was there strictly because I might be the number one Sean Lewis stan on Twitter.x.com.
Twitter, let's call it out.
Yeah. So I just loved what Sean Lewis was able to do, especially at Kent State. Because look, I'm not going to poo-poo on him too much. He was making chicken salad up there. So what he was able to do and what he was able to create was just so captivating. So a couple of teams, though, that recently caught my eye, which I don't even know if they're really hipster teams anymore, but UTSA, the Roadrunners.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of fun watching that team in the American. Exactly. So UTSA, that was a team where it's like, oh, this offense is electric. And Diego Pavia and the New Mexico State Aggies. Now, I know he just transferred out to Vanderbilt this offseason, went with his coach who took a role on the Vanderbilt staff. So I might actually have to force myself to watch some SEC ball strictly to watch Diego Pavia play for the Commodores.
Man is going to voluntarily watch Vanderbilt football. You heard that correctly. Keith is unapologetic about his interests in non-Power 5 football. But I'm going to be honest with you. If you watch this show, you know I am unapologetic in my support of Dez Tell. I think Dez Tell is so much better than people give him credit for. And he's in that group of him, Jared Dawson, and Ramon Puryear, of veteran returning guys that just get overlooked, and maybe not by the fan base, but definitely by the conference, definitely by the country. And those three are going to play pivotal roles in making sure that this interior defensive line stays disruptive. We dive into that coming up in the next segment after we tell you about our friends over at FanDuel. It's the dog days of summer. It is one of the worst times of the year, in my opinion. Like, summer's great, but there's just not many sports. And that's coming from a huge Major League Baseball fan. But nonetheless, even with the sports stop sporting, FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. This summer, FanDuel has been hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel is the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And into the second segment of this Monday edition of Locked on Louisville with producer and on-air host of From the Pink Seats podcast, Keith Arutoff. Keith, this group with three veterans who I wouldn't go as far as saying they're stars. I think that they're not stars, but they are really solid rotational players. Dez Tell is a starter, in my opinion. I think he is going to start this year. I think he is going to ultimately be one of the more underappreciated players during his time here at Louisville. I think he's a guy that's going to play on Sundays. If there is one Dez Tell fan club member on earth, it is me. If there are none, then Dalton Pence is dead. He's phenomenal. I think that his impact spans way beyond the stat sheet. He took a step forward this year, even though the statistics might not back that up, and that's okay. But you look back to the Georgia Tech game and how he forced that fumble. You look at other games this season. I think having a player like Thor, having a player like Jordan Gerard, Ashton Gelati coming back really unlocks his potential for his last season at Louisville.
See, this is how you know Dalton Pence knows ball, because D tackle play.
Thank you. My YouTube comments would suggest I don't, but I'm playing.
But no, because D tackle is one of those positions where you're never going to. You're basically, if you're just a box score watcher, you're not going to think a single defensive tackle not named Aaron Donald is good, because the numbers don't jump off the page unless you're just an absolute physical freak playing a level below what you should be playing.
Exactly.
And Dez Tell, epitome of that. This dude is just an absolute pest when it comes to opposing teams. In the run game, you have to double team him or you're not getting him off the line of scrimmage. In the passing game, he's strong enough that if you try to just put one man on him, he's going to bully the interior lineman into the quarterback's lap. So that's going to significantly impact what you're able to do in the downfield passing game. Or you better hope you have a guy who's fast and can get out of the pocket, which with the edge rushers we have on the roster this year, not going to be a fun task. So I'm glad I found another Dez Tell super fan. I'm right there with you. He's a guy who can make a huge impact. And now that he's not going to be on the field as much this year, strictly because of the added talented depth we have, I think that impact, like he can make the step from being a really good college football player to a great one this year.
Mm-hmm. I agree there. I think that giving him some opportunity, like rotating these guys in and out, Ramos sort of made it a little clear in his press conferences and the way spring practice and the spring game was conducted, is that depth is going to be utilized this season. Ramon Puryear, local guy from Eastern, has been a part of this program like Dez Tell since 2020. Like both of these guys are going into their final seasons. Puryear might be a little bit better of a pass rusher than Dez Tell. I think Puryear can play on the interior, but also slide out to the outside and play that edge spot if Gelati needs a break. A couple plays off. I don't think he's going to get a couple plays off, but maybe a play off here and there. But Puryear this past season had a career high 4 sacks, and considering the guys on the team with Gelati and Heron and other guys getting those numbers, 4 is pretty solid. Mason Reiger included in that. But Puryear, I think, being 6'3", 275 pounds, had a career high in sacks and total tackles. I'm really interested to see what that trajectory looks like, because he's probably like the least talked about of the defensive line, like of the guys that have been key members of the team for the past couple of seasons.
Yeah, and he's a bit of a unique case. I was a little surprised when you mentioned him while we were like, oh yeah, we're doing the interior lineman show, Ramon Puryear. And I'm like, yeah, I guess he does kind of play a little bit of interior, because you mentioned that sort of tweener role where it's like, okay, he's not huge, so he's not always going to be an interior lineman. He's got rush capabilities, so you can slide him over to that hand down end position if need be. Or if you're being frisky and you want to put a formation where Ashton's on the interior to just really put the interior O lineman in a chokehold. So he's one of those guys who I feel like, I'm not going to say the pressure is on this year, but like, it's time to take that next step, especially when he's not exclusively rushing from the interior of the offensive line. Like, he's going to get opportunities on the and he's going to have a much better core of starting D linemen with him. So the opportunities are going to be there for him to make some plays. So I think for him to get more playing time this year, we're going to have to see a uptick in production. Now, I'm not saying he has to go out and put up double-digit sacks, but it would be nice to have him closer to that 6-7 sacks, maybe some plays disrupted in the backfield, or maybe he's just the high-pressure guy who gets the bad sack luck. But there needs to be more, and I'm excited to see what he can do now that he actually has some more help.
Yeah, and to be completely clear, he's going to be talked about in both this episode and the edge rusher episode. He's going to see most of his time probably at the edge, I'd say, backing up Gelati. However, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about him still playing on the interior, because I think Jeff Brom is going to find ways. Mark Hagan, Mark Ivey are going to find ways to play him all over the front of the defensive line, because I think he is that talented. I think he has the frame to be able to play there as well. A guy that will play predominantly on the interior, however, is the last player that we'll talk about, last but not least, in this segment. That is Jared Dawson. Dawson might not necessarily have the same impact as a guy like Dez Tell, but 6'2", 305 pounds, has been at the very least, a solid rotational guy, 2.5 sacks each of the past 2 seasons, over 10 total tackles. I think that when you talk about why this defensive line is going to be disruptive, you talk about the players that they bring in. You also talk about the players that have ACC experience for multiple seasons that will help out with depth. Gerard Dawson is a prime candidate of that discussion.
Yeah, Gerard Dawson's a guy who, as the season continued to progress last year, got more and more play. I would expect that to be consistent with this year because he's going to be someone who probably not going to be leaned on to get a majority of those reps in early season close games while your starters are still healthy. But this is a guy who is a P4 level starter at a lot of programs, and Louisville has him as a depth piece. He's another solid interior defensive line piece, like you had mentioned, who's able to occupy blockers, not quite the physical anchor as some of the other D tackles that we mentioned, but still a very good piece that's going to command attention.
Right.
And to have that as depth on the depth chart is a blessing for Louisville's defense and will pay huge dividends late in the season when we need those strong performances against some of those teams coming down the home stretch.
I agree there. I think that it definitely helps out. And I think having 5 legitimate, really good interior options with a couple others maybe into the mix could definitely help Louisville's case out to be truly disruptive, not only during certain parts of the game, but all game long. That's going to be the key there. But can they be consistent all game long? After the 5 that we just talked about, who steps up? That's really the devil's advocate here, is the meaningful depth going to be questioned? What happens if an injury occurs? Because it's football. It's a violent sport. Guys get hurt. If a couple players get hurt for Louisville, knock on wood, hopefully they don't, who's going to step up? And we discuss who some of those players might be coming up in the next segment. And thanks for joining us into this Monday edition of Locked On Louisville, heading into the final segment with my friend, producer, and on-air talent from the Pink Seats podcast, Keith Arutoff. Once again, appreciate you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, Locked On Louisville is free and available on all streaming services 5 days a week, your team every day. Keith, outside of those players, no Tyler Barron, no Tawfiq Thomas, a handful of other players also entered the portal. You have a group of younger players on the roster that, by all means, seemingly have the ACC level talent. It's a matter of being able to show that on the field. But before with that, what's the role do you think that Rutgers transfer Renee Conga plays into this whole mix? Because he had Power 5 interest, but when you look at the stats, I know box score doesn't really show it that much, but he didn't play a ton. What is sort of the allure there with Renee Conga?
I think depth is just one of those things that absolutely you need to have on the defensive line. We may talk about it further on, but I'm a bit more optimistic on some of the younger guys in the 22 and 23 class with upcoming recruits. But I'm guessing Jeff didn't want to force the kids into action before they were ready, wanted to get a player who was on a P4 roster. I agree, didn't play that much during his time at Rutgers, but fresh legs and a fresh body to rotate in. From the limited things I was able to watch, he's going to play a similar role to like that Dez Tell, Gerard Dawson, get in there, eat up blockers, eat up blockers in the run game to try and keep the linebackers clean to make plays, make tackles. But other than that, I expect him to be a depth piece. And hey, if I'm wrong and he comes out and ends up being a stud, great. I'll happily be wrong about that. Make fun of me.
Things like, oh yeah, what if he proves you wrong? Okay, go ahead, please. But by all means, I would rather be wrong every single time in situations like this. But I think that you mentioned sort of some of the younger guys, and there's a handful of like local talent. Sadiq Clemens, Micah Carter, Selah Brown, Lou Spencer. There's a handful of guys that we just don't really know what to expect because we really haven't seen them on the field. Is there a player or couple players that you're looking at thinking, if this guy's numbers called up, I'm confident that we could see him put some solid things on the field.
So it's going back a couple of years, but the talent that Selah Brown and Wu Spencer, I believe they both were Louisville male kids.
Hey, fine high school, if I might add. I've heard that people that are alumni from that high school are really good people that, just know ball.
So, and both of them, I believe, were either 4-star prospects or flirting with a 4-star rating coming out of high school. I believe I saw Wu Spencer getting some 3 reps in spring ball. If you see injuries, I wouldn't be shocked to see those guys get some time in to get some action. I mean, the last thing you want is, we're down to 2 D tackles against Clemson on the road in Death Valley. Guess what, Selah Brown? It's your time to shine.
Well, what a welcome to Louisville moment that would be. But unfortunately for guys that are waiting for their time, I'm a firm believer in the whole, you don't have to get ready if you stay ready. And sometimes you have to, it sucks to say, but you have to overcome some pretty daunting odds to leave your mark. And if, that could be a huge, ability to create your own, hometown hero feel, like how Reggie Bonifant had that performance as a freshman on the road at Notre Dame. And
Kyle Bolin against the school to the east.
Exactly. So, I mean, it just goes to show you that sometimes the bleakest of odds can turn out some of the greatest stories. One player that really won't get talked about a ton early on, and by design, he's going to come in as a true freshman. But I find it interesting that Brian Smith, who's a Locked On Podcast national recruiting analyst, he's been on the show a couple of times, and he has a focus in Florida. He's lived in that area. He now lives in Alabama, but his main focus is Southeast recruiting. And he mentioned to me on air on the show that he believes Xavier Porter is a guy that has the talent to potentially crack into the rotation later on in his freshman season. Porter, who 6'2", 265 pounds, plays at Tampa Catholic in a really, really talented area. And he basically screams diamond in the rough type prospect in, the state of Florida, which they're seemingly that is Louisville's bread and butter in terms of recruiting. So I'm interested because we have a couple of freshmen that you don't really see a lot playing as true freshmen, but I found it interesting that Brian did make that comment. So
that is interesting. And hey, I'm more than welcome to see it if he can do it. That'd be fantastic. I've been one of the more vocal people banging the drum of high school recruiting needing to be a priority with this staff and team anyway. So yeah, the more young player hopping on the field and proving that you can make an impact straight out of high school, the better. But that's exciting to hear because, yeah, he just came in and he wasn't like a super highly touted or highly ranked player.
He was like
coming out
of the top 1,000, I believe. But I don't want to take this on a conversation that could go another 40 minutes. And you know where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this. I agree with the high school recruiting side of things. Like, if there are a couple positions that I wish Louisville would prioritize in high school recruiting, I feel like defensive line is definitely one of them in terms of a purely developmental aspect. Defensive line, quarterback, and then you can maybe go cornerback as well, maybe. But defensive line and quarterback would be my top 2 spots. But nonetheless, that is a conversation that, who knows, we might have one day. We might have on signing day. Hopefully it's not as jaded as, some of the fan base is at the moment, who just can't believe what we're doing in the high school recruiting rankings. But it is what it is. Well, I said let's wait until December. We got the commitment from CJ May, which is great. Hopefully we get some more big-time recruits in the coming months. But that is going to wrap up this Monday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here tomorrow.